Installing Configuration Manager and upgrading from SMS 2003. Okay, so we're through the introductory parts of this series, and now we're on to the meat and potatoes. In this, and pretty much the rest of this series, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the specific configurations in Configuration Manager and how you're going to want to set it up so you can accomplish what you need to accomplish. And starting now also, we're going to be seeing a lot of the screens and the wizards and the things that we need to actually click in order to configure our instance so we can do what we need to. In this nugget, we're going to talk about the installation prerequisites, both hardware and software, that we need to have for our system. What levels of operating system do our systems need to be at? What sort of hardware do they need to be able to have in order to support Configuration Manager? Once we understand what those prerequisites are, then we're going to go through a primary site installation. And as you'll remember from our previous discussions, we're going to spend most of the time in this series talking about a single SMS server, and this SMS server hosting most of the roles that we need in order to accomplish what we need. And in this primary site installation, we've got a couple of different steps that are required in order for us to be able to get the bits and bytes onto this server. The first thing we need to do is extend the schema. And there are a couple of different ways in which you can extend the schema in Configuration Manager 2007. There's our old friend EXT-ADSCH, and there's also this new LDF method that we can use. We'll talk about both of those a little bit. For a brand new installation, we also need to extend the schema through a manual process, then that's adding the systems management container to our schema. And this can be kind of a challenging process, kind of a difficult process if you're not used to manually updating your Active Directory schema, but don't worry, we'll talk about how you can do that. Before we actually go through the installation, Configuration Manager 2007 has this installation prerequisite checker tool. And this tool is really good because before we actually begin the process of installing Configuration Manager, it's going to let us know which prerequisites have we correctly installed, which ones are still missing, so that we know that when we complete the installation, it will complete correctly. And then lastly, we'll go through the installation wizard itself and what you need to know in order to get through that installation wizard. Our final thing that we're going to talk about in this nugget is the process of upgrading from SMS 2003. And there's a couple things you need to know, and most of what we're going to talk about there is a lot of whiteboarding. But the process to upgrade from SMS 2003, there are a couple of different ways you can do it. Some are a little easier in some ways, and some are a little more difficult. So we'll go through those processes now. But before we actually get into the clicky of the installation part, let's talk a little bit about the prerequisites. You're going to need to know these prerequisites because you want to make sure that you have your server properly prepared before you begin the process of installing any components to it. Now, first of all, and I'll apologize for the bad box here, but there are some hardware requirements not only for the client side here on the left, but also for the site system servers here on the right. And remember, a client is going to be any one of those systems that the Configuration Manager infrastructure is managing. It's going to be your desktops. It's going to be other servers. Any site system is, again, any server that manages or that has some part of Configuration Manager components on it. And you'll see here we have sort of the minimum expected processor and also the recommended amount of processor space, and the minimum amount of RAM and the recommended amount of RAM, and also for disk space as well here too. A couple of important points to note on here. Actually, some of these recommendations have to do with what components you're going to be using as part of your SMS infrastructure. You'll see here that we have 128/256, which is the minimum amount of RAM required for the client, and 256 is the recommended. 384 meg of RAM is for the client in the case that you're using OSD or operating system deployment. In those cases, you're going to want to make sure you have a little bit more RAM in there to support that capability. The same thing down here on the site system server. Site system also has a 5 gigabyte requirement for if you just need to be able to install the site system, the basic componentry of the site system. But if you want to use that OSD deployment too down here, you're going to require at least 15 gigs of space on that site system. And if you remember, operating systems have a lot larger amount of disk requirements because there's just so much more there. So you'll have to have a lot more disk space, probably a lot more even than just this minimum 15 gigs, in order to support the deployment of operating systems. Down here on the bottom too, we talk about the operating systems that are supported. And really these aren't hardware requirements, but you need to have minimally this operating system installed to be able to support Configuration Manager. At the client, Configuration Manager will support greater than or equal to Windows 2000 Service Pack 4. So anything above Windows 2000 Service Pack 4 is an acceptable client to be managed through Configuration Manager. On the site system side, they need to be at least Windows 2003 Service Pack 1. And the reason for this is because there's more functionality in Server 2003 at Service Service Pack 1 that is relied upon by the site system server for its operation. Now, all this being said, there are some unsupported operating systems that, for the client purposes, that you're not going to be able to manage using your Configuration Manager instance. Now, you'll see here under supported OSs, these are all for the client. This is really nothing to do with the site system servers, but 95, 98, and ME are out, as are the non-business editions of XP here. You'll see Home and Starter and Media Center editions are designed for consumers and not for the enterprise environments. And also XP Pro with less than Service Pack 2. So really, if you're using XP Pro, you're going to have a minimum of Service Pack 2, and these days really that's a requirement for a lot of applications. So you're really probably there anyway at this point. Also with Vista, any of the non-business editions of Vista, Starter, Home Basic, Home Premium, and old NT is no longer supported by Configuration Manager, as well as older versions of Windows Server. So be aware that if you have these clients in your environment, you're not going to be able to support them and manage them using Configuration Manager. You're simply not going to be able to install the client onto these operating systems. Now that we have that under control, let's actually talk a little bit about some of the software requirements that are required for Configuration Manager. Now, these are specific to the site system server. Now, you'll see number one, IIS 6.0 is required if the system's going to perform any of these systems roles down here. It's a bits-enabled distribution point, a management point, reporting point, software upper point, or server locator point. IIS 6 is going to be required for those roles in order to support the transfer of information back and forth. Now, a lot of the client communication is going to occur over HTTP or HTTPS, depending on what mode you're in too. So that's the reason for IIS being required here. Now, Configuration Manager distribution point systems using bits throttling are going to require bits 2.0 or later. And that's really bits 2.0 is been around for a long time, and that's sort of the standard at the time that we're recording this, 4 bits. Management points and server locator points that need to be configured with high availability can be done as part of network load balancing clusters. These are NLB clusters. This is not a failover cluster like you're used to thinking. This is more or less a load balancing cluster if you want to support high availability for either management points or server locator points. Got to be at Internet Explorer 5.0 or later, and Windows Server 2008 is the only supported system for hosting the System Health Validator point. Network access protection, which is something we'll talk about in a future nugget, is a feature that is available to Server 2008 when it's managed by Server 2008. And part of network access protection is the System Health Validator point, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. In addition to these requirements that are for each potential role in your Configuration Manager infrastructure, there are also some common requirements too, some more software requirements that are kind of going to be common across a lot of the roles here. Number one is the MMC 3.0. The console that you'll be using for Configuration Manager requires the framework that comes with MMC 3.0. You know what MMC 3.0 is because it's the one that has the actions pane on the right side. .NET Framework 2.0 is also required for all site systems. And although not all site systems require SQL Server, you do have to have a SQL Server in your environment to support depositing the data that Configuration Manager is going to store and pull from your clients. Now, that has to be a full version of SQL. It can be standard, it can be enterprise, but it cannot be Express Edition. That's the free edition of SQL. It has to be essentially a for-cost version of SQL Server, and it must be at Service Pack 2. And lastly, each individual site role is going to have a lot of additional other requirements of certain patches need to be installed, certain security patches need to be installed in order so they'll fully support and securely support their functionality. Now, really the moral behind this, rather than having me go into each individual one, is for each of the servers in your environment, just make sure they're fully patched. And as long as you're fully patched and you've got the most recent service packs on those site servers, you're probably going to be able to support all of the site roles that you need in order to support Configuration Manager. So all this being said, we're really still not ready to begin the installation process because we want to talk a little bit about extending the schema. Now again, extending the schema is an optional activity, but you'll find you're probably going to want to do it if your forest is ready to support it. And unarguably, the process of extending the schema, the technical part of extending the schema, in a lot of ways can be more difficult or less difficult than the political process associated with extending the schema if you've ever had to do these before. I've actually brought up here not not the site server, but in fact the domain controller for our nuggetlab.com domain. And I've brought up in my computer, and we're taking a look here at the drive that's got Configuration Manager in it. And I'm going to open up the drive here, and I'm going to go to SMS Setup, and then I'm going to go to bin, and I'm going to go i386 because this is installed on a not a 64-bit server here. And what I want to show you are a couple of tools that you can use for the process of extending the schema. Now, this process needs to be done once per forest, only one time per forest, and it's really not reversible. Once you do it, you really can't undo it because the schema is not something you can really undo. There are two ways with which you can extend the schema, and really it's up to you in terms of which of the two ways you want to use. The first way is to use a tool that is provided called extadsch. So let me go ahead and click in here, and I'm going to go extadsch right here. This tool will automatically extend the schema with all of the new columns and rows and entries that are needed by Configuration Manager. And if you double click this, or if you run it from the command line, which is probably a little better, it will run, it will complete, and then you're done. Now, in order to be able to do this, you need to be a schema admin. The user account that you're using needs to be a schema admin, and the forest needs to be configured so it will accept schemas. Now, if you're at server 2003, if your domain's at 2003, that's already done for you. If you're not at 2003, you need to do a little hack to support it. So running this tool will complete the schema extension. Now, some people may have a problem with how this tool operates, because historically this extadsch tool, it just sort of provided a response that said, okay, done. Well, because of this, Microsoft has provided another mechanism for extending the schema, and it's through this LDF file. And if you've ever done an AD prep, if you've ever done a preparing your domain for an upgrade from an old version to a new version from Windows 2000 to 2003, and you remember these LDF files that were on the server media, this is the same thing. An LDF file is a file that can be used to change the schema, more or less. Let me show you what this looks like here. If I open up the LDF file here in Notepad, I'm going to open it up and select the program and open it up in Notepad here. You'll see that the LDF file here, and there's a little text here at the top, is going to go through and make some modifications to the schema. Now, this is the exact same thing that other tool is doing, but it's doing so here in a way that will actually let you see what is happening and see what is being accomplished here. So you say here, the first change is this section adds a new attribute for SMS capabilities, which is a new attribute for SMS v4. You'll see that this attribute updates the MS SMS Management Point class. And this is the information. Here's the DN, the distinguished name for that change, what the type of the change is, the object class, where it's at, the attribute ID, and the syntax. So this is all of that information about what is specifically being changed in your Active Directory when you make this schema modification. Now, one thing you do have to do is you just kind of scroll through here, is take a look and see if this may conflict with your existing Active Directory configuration, your schema configuration. For the most part, we don't make a lot of schema changes that aren't given to us by vendors. And so unless you've done some custom configurations, some custom schema configurations, you're probably going to be okay. Now, the converse of that is true as well. If you haven't done a lot of custom configurations, then, or if you have done a lot of custom configurations, then you may want to just double check these to make sure these aren't going to conflict with what you've put and what you've customized in your Active Directory. If you do decide to use this schema configuration change, you'll notice here that the last component here under the distinguished name is DC equals X. And if you're going to make this schema change or use this LDF file, you're going to have to put in the identifier for your domain controller. Or excuse me, your domain. So in our case, we would actually change this from DC equal X for DC equals nugget lab, comma, DC equals com. Now, you probably want to do a find and replace for this because this DC equals X is going to be located on each one of these changes here. You notice how it says DC equals X here and a little bit further down as well. But you're going to want to have to change this entire location so that it corresponds to the name, the fully qualified domain name of your domain. When you get done with that, when you get done with making these changes, you're actually going to go back down here, and from the start command, you're going to run. We're going to bring up CMD, and I'm going to paste in a command in here, paste. We're going to run ldifde, which is a tool to use to manipulate the Active Directory, ldifde-i-f, and this is the name of the LDF file that we were just talking about, -v-j, and then a log file, so mylog.txt. If we run this, this is going to go ahead and make the manipulations to the Active Directory, and it gives you a way of seeing for each change whether it was successful or not. Now, obviously, with any of these schema manipulations that are going to go on, you only have really one chance to get it done right. And so, consequently, I want to do this schema manipulation, but I don't want to use this ldiff to e tool. No, instead, what I want to do is use the extadsch command line tool so you can take a look and see how it operates. And also, arguably, it's a little easier to use. So I'm going to go to the D drive, and I'm going to go to SMS setup bin i386. Here, and I'm going to go dir ext, and I find there's extadsch.exe. This is the tool that's going to manipulate our Active Directory and change the schema. And really, all I need to do is to extadsch and hit the enter key. It will begin and it will complete the schema manipulation. And now we know that that schema manipulation has been completed. Of course, the first thing you're going to say is, wait a minute, Greg, I've got really no response here. I don't really know if it got updated. Was there a problem? What got changed? You'll see that this command doesn't really provide me much information. Well, actually, there is some information provided for you, but it's not actually located as a result from the command. If we go and minimize this and bring up my computer and go to the local disk here, and you'll see this extadsch.log file. And here, if I open this up, and if I open this up here and show you, you'll see that what we've done is we've modified the Active Directory schema, and this is the log file associated with that modification. You'll see here that some of these elements already exist. You'll see here that loveitlag.com was updated, so some of these were successfully updated, etc. We've successfully extended the Active Directory schema. Now you'll notice here that we see some things have already existed here. Roaming boundaries already exist. Default MP already exists. Device management point already exists. There's a couple of things you need to be aware of when you're updating the schema for Configuration Manager 2007, and specifically if you were using SMS 2003 before. The upgrade, the schema change for Configuration Manager 2007 is essentially adds some more things to what was already done for the 2003, the SMS 2003 schema change. And so if you're using the extadsch tool, you're probably going to be okay by just running the tool. It will find that things have already existed and populate what is necessary. But if you're going to use the LDF file mechanism, you are going to have to make some manipulations to the file to ensure that it creates the correct changes appropriately. And I'm going to direct you to the Microsoft website for what those changes are because they're rather complex. But just be very careful when you're doing these schema manipulations, because if you've already done the manipulation before for SMS 2003, you got to be just conscious of what you're doing. The second thing that we need to talk about too when we're talking about schema changes is, as with any schema change, this is one time per forest. And so we have to make this schema change for the forest itself. In order to do that, we also need to make sure that replication occurs from the domain controller that we do it, the schema master that we perform the change on, out to all the other domain controllers in the forest. And that, depending on the size of your environment, may be a very long period of time. So be conscious of how long it takes to complete that replication. So, and lastly too, and we didn't really do this here, but in a production environment, it's a good idea generally to back up the Active Directory before you make changes like this, because again, this is an irreversible change. You don't want to do anything that's bad for you. So this is the process of actually going through and manipulating the Active Directory. The other thing we have to do today is also create the container, the systems management container. Now what you'll notice here is, because my domain's already been extended for SMS 2003, is this system management container will already be present in my Active Directory. But what I want to show you is where it's at and how you would make this change in yours so that you can create this new container. So let me go ahead and bring up my machine here. Here's a machine that I have ADSI Edit installed onto. If I click on the Start and the Run menu and type in ADSI Edit.msc, that'll bring open the tool called ADSI Edit. Now, if you're wondering where you find this tool, this is actually in the Windows Support Tools, which is available on the server media. The name of the file is suptools.msi. So what you're looking for is ADSI Edit. And if I go down and click down through Domain and then nuggetlab.com and System here, you'll see, you will not see this if this is a brand new instance of Configuration Manager or SMS. We have an element in here, a container in here called System Management. And because this domain has already been extended for SMS 2003, you'll see we have some items underneath here. If you were creating a new container, you would right-click on the System node here and create a new object. The type of object you would create is an object container. Right here, you see container, and we click Next. And then we type in the value, which would be system manage and click Next to finish. Now we already have that here. Because we've created this before, I'm going to show you once again. The second thing that you need to do in order to correctly create this system management container and enable your configuration management server to populate it with information is to right-click and choose Properties of the container itself. Now if you've never played around before in ADSI Edit, you're essentially manipulating the Active Directory schema whenever you do this. And just like files and folders, you have security elements on the Active Directory schema as well. We're looking at Attribute Editor here. We're now moving over to the Security tab. In order to allow our server the ability to manipulate this container and add information into this container, we're going to add its computer record in. So I'm going to change the object types here to add in computers, and I'm going to type in the name of the object. In this case, my configuration management server is sccm nugget. Just double check the name here, and yes, that's going to work. And so we click OK. We want to grant this server full control permissions to the object, and then we want to apply this not only to the server, this object for the server, but also the child objects of the server as well. So we're going to click this Advanced button, and it's going to bring forth the Advanced Options menu that allows us to choose what we apply this to. I'm going to click on sccm nugget here. I'm going to choose Edit. I'm going to apply to this object and all child objects as well. So what this does is this allows my server, the server itself, to manipulate and control the configuration of this container inside of my Active Directory. You'll see sccm nugget there. You'll see SMS nugget from SMS 2003 instance, which is also present in this environment. So sccm nugget there, we click OK, and so now we have completed all of the things we need to do with the schema, all of this scary stuff we need to do with the schema to prepare our Active Directory for the installation of our configuration management server. So let's take a look at where we're at right now. We've actually talked about the prerequisites. We've done the primary site installation, at least the first steps right before we begin the installation specific to extending the schema and that systems management container. Now let's go ahead and switch back to our configuration management server. I want to talk for just a minute about this configuration management server. It has already been installed with Microsoft SQL Server 2005, really with all the defaults. We've essentially installed a default instance of SQL Server 2005, and that's because this site server is also going to store the database for our configuration manager instance. So let's go ahead and walk through the installation process at this point. I'm going to click on my computer and open up the Configuration Manager CD here. You'll see we get the splash screen for System Center Configuration Manager 2007. And then we get the start screen as well. We can read the release notes, run the prerequisite checker, or just begin installing Configuration Manager 2007. The one thing we want to do first, because I know that there are some prerequisites we have not installed at this point, we're going to run this prerequisite checker and also give you an idea of what to expect whenever you're going to run that prerequisite checker. Now the good thing about this is before we had the prerequisite checker, really understanding the things that needed to be installed meant more research on your part. You'd have to go through and look at the documentation, look at the release notes, and verify that indeed all of the prerequisites and IIS and bits and all those things were installed before the process would begin. Now with this checker, with this prerequisite checker, it's going to do a lot of this troubleshooting for you so that you'll know exactly what you may be missing on this server. So we're going to do a primary site, and our SQL server is this server as well, sccm nugget. And the management point is the same thing, sccm nugget, because all of our roles we're going to store on the same server right here. We're going to click OK. And then the next screen, we're going to begin the process of doing the prerequisite checks. Now, you'll see it doesn't take very long. And you'll also see that we've got a number of errors and warnings on this server because we haven't updated the server to the level that we need to. Now, let's take a look at these so we can see what we got to make sure we install. We got to make sure that this knowledge base article 932303 is installed. We got to make sure that the WSS SDK is on there. We got to make sure that the security mode is set right and the IIS service is running and bits is enabled and these sorts of things. Now, the good thing about these is that if we're ever concerned about what we need to do, if we want to learn more information, we can always double-click the prerequisite to learn what specifically we need to install. So if I double-click this 932303, we find out that the WMI service may stop responding. We need to apply this patch in order for it to function properly. Same thing with WSS SDK. We need to go to this location to complete that installation. For the SQL Server Security mode, we see here that it's specified for SQL Authentication Security. We want to make sure we're only in Windows Authentication Security. So this is really good news for us because it helps us understand what we've got to get installed first. Now I'm going to put the recording on pause. I'm going to get all of these prerequisites taken care of so that we can successfully complete the prerequisite checker and begin the installation process. So when we come back, we're going to pass this check. We're going to have successfully passed the check and be ready to complete the installation. And poof, we're back. Don't you wish all server administration was this easy? Just poof, and all the prerequisites are done. So what I've done in the meantime, while I paused the recording, was completed all of those prerequisites, installed the things that needed to be installed, made the configuration changes that need to be made. And if we go back and run that prerequisite checker again, and we do sccm nugget and sccm nuggets, and we hit OK here, and we're just going to run all the checks, and we're going to show that all the tests have completed, and we're now ready to start the installation of System Center Configuration Manager. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the splash screen here, and we're going to start the installation. So we click Install Configuration Manager 2007. And now, before starting the wizard, we need to make sure that we have a supported Microsoft SQL Server installation, which we do. We know the name of the computer, which is this one, and we've reviewed the release notes, and we know that we've met the minimum requirements for the hardware. We've already talked about all of those now, so we can begin. We are going to install a configuration manager site server as opposed to administrator console, and we're going to obviously review the licensing terms. And then now we're going to have an option of whether we want to choose custom settings or simple settings. In almost every case, you're going to want to choose custom settings because then you're going to get all of the options for how you want to set up your environment. So we're going to choose custom settings here now and click Next. Now we want a primary site because primary site has its own SQL Server database. And as we talked about before, we have a SQL Server installed on this server because that's where we're going to store that data. We'll talk a little later about secondary sites and what they mean. If we click Next here, we can choose the Customer Experience Improvement Program configuration. And if you want to send information about your experience to Microsoft, you can click Yes here to send that use data off to Microsoft. We're going to choose No here. And poof, again, actually, I had to pause the recording here while I punched in my 25-character product key because I wasn't really all that interested in sharing it with you. But there is a screen that we actually missed here where you simply just punch in your product key, and it's pretty standard, so something you're used to seeing. In this screen, we choose where do we want to install Configuration Manager. We'll choose the defaults, and now we get to the site settings screen. Now here's very, very important because SMS relates each site server or each site to a 3-digit site code, 3-character site code, for example here XYZ. And then throughout your entire Configuration Manager instance, your whole architecture across all of your organization, there can be no duplicate site codes. And changing those site codes is a real pain in the neck. So make sure when you're doing the planning for how you want to set up your Configuration Manager instance, especially when you have multiple servers out there and multiple sites out there, that you aren't going to have site code conflicts between servers. In our case, we're going to call it CBN for CBT Nuggets, and we're going to give it a site name. We're going to call it CBT Nuggets SCCM. We can call it a headquarters site here. We can call it whatever we want. This is essentially the friendly name identifier for this site. If I click Next here, I can choose whether or not I want to install Configuration Manager in native mode or in mixed mode. And late in this series, we're going to talk about the differences between native mode and mixed mode. But for what you need to know here, in order to install Configuration Manager in native mode, you're going to have a public key infrastructure, a PKI infrastructure in place. Now, that is a topic that is really not heavily touched upon for the test, but is something you're going to need to know if you want to support native mode. Now, what do you get out of native mode? Out of native mode, you get the ability to support internet-based clients, so they're clients that are out on the internet that need to connect in and get managed through the internet. And also, there's a little bit more connection security between clients and servers to servers that happens when you're in native mode. But you do have to have a public key infrastructure in place to support that. For now, we're actually going to choose mixed mode, which has the ability to support SMS 2003 clients. Not that we really care in this instance, but it does not require that PKI in order to operate. Like I said, a little bit later on, we're going to talk about native mode and show kind of what you need to know in terms of making that move from mixed mode to native mode. But for now, we're just going to choose mixed mode because it's a little bit easier. We choose Next. And then now we choose what types of agents we want to enable with the default settings. And these are the types of agents we'll be talking about over the next couple of nuggets that have to do with inventory and programs and software updates and metering and those sorts of things. Now you'll see here by default all of these are checked. These are all sort of the typical things that Configuration Manager can do for you, with the single exception of network access protection. Now network access protection requires Server 2008. In order to use network access protection, you're going to have Server 2008 and Vista clients. So in this case, we're going to enable all of the settings here that we have with the single exception of network access protection, which we'll be talking about a later nugget, so don't worry about that, so that we can make use of all of these components in our clients. We click Next again, and then now we get to choose which SQL server we're going to select to store the data. Obviously, our SQL server is locally installed, so our SQL server is going to be the local server name, which is sccm nugget. And then the site database is always SMS underscore, and then the 3-digit site code. That's the default site database for you. So be aware that you're going to need to include the location for your SQL server whenever you make this selection. We click Next again. And we talk about installing the SMS provider. Now, this is something new to Configuration Manager 2007. If you're used to SMS 2003, we didn't necessarily have this as a separate installation. The SMS provider is what is used by the console to communicate with the database. It's a series of essentially translations, calls that provide information from the database to the console. You have to have the SMS provider enabled. It has to be up and functioning for the consoles to be able to talk to the database. And you'll notice here that it can't be installed on a clustered SQL server. In our case, we're going to install the provider onto the same location as everything else, which is this sccm nugget location, but that can be installed elsewhere. Note that the SMS provider is actually a pretty large installation. It's actually many hundreds of megabytes in size. So be aware of that where you're going to install that. And if you want that to be on a separate server, you can do that as well. In our case, we're not going to do that here. We're going to put it on the same server. I'm going to click Next. We also want to install a management point. A management point is used for clients to talk into the site itself. We have to have a management point at some point on some server for our clients to be able to talk to our site and be able to communicate and be managed by our site. We can choose not to install a management point and do so later, but in this case, because our management point is the same server as our site server, we're just going to go ahead and put that in here so it installs a management point by default. The next thing we want to choose is how we want to set up our HTTP and HTTPS settings. In this case, we're going to use our default port, which is port 80, or we could use a custom port of any port that we want. Now remember, our clients are going to be using this port in order to communicate to the site server, in order to communicate into the Configuration Manager infrastructure. And so if you want to choose a different port for security reasons or because your security policy doesn't want you to choose port 80, you can do that. If we had chose native mode, we would also be able to configure our HTTPS settings for secure communication. As I talked about before, whenever you're selecting native mode, one of the benefits you get is more secure communication between clients and servers. In this case, because we've chosen mixed mode, we don't get to select those settings. In our case, we're going to use a default port and click Next. One of the very, very neat things about the installation wizard for Configuration Manager is that as Microsoft updates Configuration Manager in its installation process, there may be some prerequisites that change over time. Now you think about it, right? Maybe they find that a piece of code was poorly written and they need to do an update, or pieces of Configuration Manager may break, or maybe they figure out a way to do something better. Well, as part of the installation, you can instruct the installation to check for updates and download those updates to a path local to this machine. If I click Next here, I can choose an alternate path to install these prerequisite components. In my case, I'm going to create a C drive, and I'm going to create a folder here called Downloads. And I'm going to point my alternate path here for these updates to C Downloads here. When I click Next, it's going to begin to download the manifest and also any additional updates that Microsoft has chosen that need to be part of the installation for Configuration Manager. You'll see here that at the time of this recording, there are 88 files that have been updated, that Microsoft has changed, and that need to be part of this installation. So what I'm going to do, because this can take an extended period of time, is actually pause this recording while we go through the download, and when we come back, we'll see what the next step is in this installation process. Again, the neat part about this is that once we complete the installation, we'll know that we are at the highest level of that Microsoft has released for Configuration Manager. We don't have to worry about digging around anymore to find these prerequisites and find these updates and make sure that we're fully patched. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, and when we come back, we'll be ready to go for our next step. And we're back. You'll see here now that we've successfully downloaded all of the prerequisite components. I'm going to click OK here. And now we've pretty much done everything that we need to do to start the installation process. We've given the setup type, the site code, and the database name, and all this stuff. We've provided everything that we need to so that the installation can begin its process. When I click Next here, Setup's going to do that prerequisite checker. What we talked about before with that prerequisite checker. It's going to rerun the prerequisite check to make sure that all of those prerequisites have been completed properly. And as you'll see here, because we correctly did the prerequisite checker before we started the installation, that we now have successfully completed them all. You can see here that because this checker is at the end of the installation process, if you got this far and didn't do it at first, you could get kind of frustrated when you found out that there were still things you needed to do. So as a note, make sure you always do that prerequisite checker before you start the installation. Now that we have success here, we can click the button to begin the installation. You'll see now that it's going to go through the process of creating accounts and configuring the registry and the database and transferring files and all those sorts of things. And as the status changes from not started to completed, once all of these get to completed, we will have completed the installation of our SMS system. You'll see here these are now in progress. So once again, I'm going to pause the recording while we get through all of this and let the installation complete. When we come back, I'll show you the last screen. We'll take a look at the system, the Configuration Manager console, and then move on to the topic of upgrading from SMS 2003. So I'm going to put it in pause here, and we'll come right back. And we're back, or poof, or whatever you'd like me to say. Essentially, we've completed the installation of Configuration Manager, and now we're looking at the post-installation screen here. If we tick the box here, we'll actually launch the console upon closing. I wanted to show you this piece because we want to actually view the log associated with the installation. Now, this log is very complicated, and it'll take a lot of parsing of on your part to actually verify that everything is installed properly, but you can use this log to validate that the installation has completed correctly, and it'll show you all the things that were done as part of the installation. You know, it's checking if there's a proxy server, verifying file hashes and those sorts of things, and creating SQL objects. And down here at the bottom, it essentially says, okay, we're ready to move to the finish page because the installation configuration processes are done. This is useful if you have errors in the installation, and you shouldn't if you've passed all your prerequisites and everything's correct. You shouldn't have any errors, but this gives you a little bit of ammunition to troubleshoot whenever you have problems with an installation. I'm going to click the Finish button here, and we're going to complete the installation. And because I ticked the box, we're going to bring forward the SMS console for our very first use. You'll see here down it's loading, and we're adding in that console into our MMC console. And then now we get the the System Center Configuration Manager console. If you're familiar with SMS, a lot of the things that you're seeing in here are going to be relatively similar to what you're used to seeing with SMS. We have site management and computer management. There's a little bit of changes from what you're used to seeing, but for the most part, a lot of things are going to be where they were before. A couple of the neat things are the ability to create folders and drag and drop, and also the actions pane over here for more visibility to what actions are available. But I just wanted to show you this. We're going to spend pretty much the rest of our time throughout this series at the Configuration Manager console to talk about all these different nodes here under computer management and site management and system status and those sorts of things. So this is what it looks like. We're going to spend a lot of time at the end of this series. You're going to be very, very comfortable with all the pieces here inside of the Configuration Manager console. Okay, so we have one more topic to talk about in this nugget, and that really is the upgrade from SMS 2003 to Configuration Manager. And rather than go through the process of showing you all the wizard screens again, because the wizard screens are more or less functionally the same in an upgrade as they are from a complete installation, I just want to show you some guidelines so that you can prepare yourself whenever you consider doing an upgrade if you are going to do an upgrade. So what I want to show you first of all here is these little guidelines that I've compiled from various sources that talk about the upgrade process from SMS 2003. So let's talk about them one at a time. Configuration Manager sites cannot be child sites of SMS sites, but the reverse can happen. If you're an SMS 2003 site, you can be a child site of a Configuration Manager site. So if you're going to do an upgrade, you need to make sure you do the upgrades in the right order. Native mode configuration management sites cannot be child sites of mixed mode sites. So you got to make sure that whenever you're doing your hierarchy, also make sure you know where you're going to apply native mode and where you're going to apply mixed mode. Configuration Manager clients cannot be be assigned to an SMS 2003 site, but SMS 2003 clients can be assigned to a configuration manager site. What the gist of this means is that essentially you have to install or upgrade the server before you upgrade the client so that the clients don't lose communication as part of the upgrade. You cannot actually manage SMS 2003 primary sites to the console, but you can do secondary sites when they are directly below a configuration manager site. Essentially, in the case where a secondary site is secondary to a configuration manager site, then you can manage it through the configuration manager console. Now, we haven't talked about sites all that much yet, and we will a little later, but keep this in mind when we talk about that as you consider your upgrade. I've got a second batch of thoughts here also, that SMS 2003 clients must be upgraded as after their site server. We talked about this just above here. You've got to do the site servers first, and then you can go ahead and push the upgrade to the clients. The sites, the SMS 2003 sites, to be upgraded must be set to advanced security, and all clients must be advanced clients. If you have any of those other security or clients out there, the legacy clients or whatnot, those need to be advanced clients. And that's because Configuration Manager's security model is essentially equivalent to advanced security, and the clients are equivalent to advanced clients. All of the feature packs in SMS 2003 must be uninstalled except for the ITMU. And so if you have those additional feature packs, if you have OSD or any of those other feature packs that are out there, device management feature pack, those must be uninstalled. And any customizations to your SMS def MOF file will not survive the upgrade. And so this being stated, if you've done any of those customizations, take a copy of that MOF file first, and then apply them once you get completed. We'll talk about all that. If you're unfamiliar with the SMS def MOF file, we'll talk about all that later on in this series. Lastly, the way you want to go through the upgrade process is by starting with your central site and then working your way down to the hierarchy. You got to start up at the top and then work your way. If that central server has any secondaries, continue to them. Its primaries below it, continue to those, and work your way down the hierarchy starting with that central site. And in some cases, a parallel configuration manager instance may be a better option. If you don't like your site structure, if you don't like the way you've set up your architecture for the environment, in some cases, maybe setting up a parallel instance so you've got SMS 2003 and Configuration Manager both servicing the same clients. That may be a better solution for you too. Again, there's more work involved with doing that parallel instance, but it's easier if you have to do manipulations of site servers and you've got to change around your architecture a little bit. Sometimes that's a better way of doing things. So again, we're not going to go through this the actual clicky and the steps of doing the upgrade process, but be aware of these notes and these ideas when you're doing your upgrade, because you will need to know these for the test, and that they're good ideas so that you will have a successful upgrade when it comes time to actually do it in your environment. So let's talk about what we've discussed over the last few minutes. We've talked about installing Configuration Manager. We've talked about the installation prerequisites. We've talked about hardware and software, and we also did that primary site installation here too. We talked about extending the schema and the systems management container, and also the prerequisite checker, which saves us so much time and so much energy when it comes to preparing ourselves for the installation. And then lastly, we talked about this the concept of upgrading from SMS 2003. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.